Sleep in Peace Tonight is a historical novel based on the true facts in World War II, and the central character is Harry Hopkins. Hopkins was Roosevelt's envoy to London at the height of the Blitz in January 1941. Hopkins was to act as the crucial link between Churchill and Roosevelt as the war unfolded. But nobody in London knew anything about Hopkins or indeed had ever heard of him. And when Churchill was told that Harry Hopkins was to be Roosevelt's envoy to London, he simply said, "Who?" Hopkins had had a terrible journey to London. It had taken him 4 days, leaving New York, flying down to Brazil, across to Africa, up to Lisbon, and finally by a BOAC flying boat to get to England. And when he arrived at Poole Harbour in Dorset, Brendan Bracken, Churchill's key advisor, was there to meet him, and they thought Hopkins was dead. When they got aboard the plane, there was his figure lying slumped in the back, absolutely lifeless. He came round on the train to London, thanks to some very good Scotch whisky, and arrived that night at Waterloo Station at the height of an incendiary raid when London was literally ablaze. Hopkins could not believe his eyes nor his ears. He was driven to Claridge's Hotel, and there he went straight to the bar where he met Ed Murrow, the famous American correspondent. He said to Murrow, "Is it always like this here?" And Murrow said, "This is nothing. Wait till the heavy bombers get over at midnight." The meeting was over lunch at Downing Street in a basement dining room. Churchill knew he had to win and woo Hopkins, and the lunch proceeded with a variety of very nice wines to the stage where brandy and coffee was being served, large brandies, as Hopkins noted in his diary that night. Throughout this lunch, Churchill described Britain's war situation in dire terms. When Hopkins asked about the possibility of an invasion, Churchill admitted that there was a strong possibility that that spring, when the weather improved, the invasion barges which were lined up and down the Channel coast of France and Belgium and Holland would be unleashed. Hopkins then was told by Churchill that they could resist the invasion, that the Royal Navy would be the deciding factor, that the Channel would be turned red with Nazi blood. But it was when he took Hopkins into an adjoining room and showed him maps of the Atlantic and said that that was where the real battle would be fought and won or lost, and it was on that battle that the future of Western civilization depended, that Hopkins realized that what Churchill was after was not just American supplies across the Atlantic. He wanted their ships in the Atlantic and the American boots on the ground in Britain and Europe. The relationship between Churchill and Hopkins developed very rapidly in January and February 1941. This mostly took place in No. 10 Downing Street and at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence. Hopkins was appalled to find how cold these houses were. There was no heating of any kind that he could discern. And he was amazed to be received by Churchill very often in the bathroom, where the Prime Minister would be happy splashing around in his bath, and Hopkins would sit shivering on a stool in his overcoat. This was an extraordinary way for the British Prime Minister to receive and negotiate with an American envoy, but it is what happened. Churchill was very keen to find out what Hopkins was sending back to the White House. Hopkins was using naval communications at the President's request, and these were coded and secret communications. Churchill therefore devised a plan, and this is the fictional part of my book, to give Hopkins a driver, an attractive young woman called Leonora Finch, who was actually a British agent, an intelligence agent. Her job was to find out not just what Hopkins was thinking, but what he was telling the President. And what he was actually telling the President, and this is on the historical record, was that Britain would not survive without American help. And that help would have to be much more than just sending tins of spam across the Atlantic or other food supplies. And that's what so alarmed the President in the White House. He ordered Hopkins' return, and by the time Hopkins did return in February 1941, his relationship with the driver had begun. he was in love with Leonora Finch. Harry Hopkins played a crucial role in the Second World War, and I think that will strike a chord on both sides of the Atlantic. He fostered a relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill on which the outcome of the war depended. Historians and academics know this. They know the work that Hopkins put into that relationship, but the wider public on either side of the Atlantic does not. Hopkins, in many ways, is a forgotten hero, an American hero, and should be a hero to us here in England. And it is a book that I hope will bring Harry Hopkins back into the public eye.